Thank you. A very big thank you to Phil and Dawn for inviting us to this wonderful symposium on street life. The first stage of our ESRC project that we're going to share with you today essentially focuses on the economic prospects and life of the high street. And then the second phase, which we will begin next year, begins to engage the question that if retailers are in some way economically agile, does that translate into some form of political agility? And if so, what would that look like? Today, our central question that we want to ask with you is what the seemingly ordinary or even parochial space of the street tells us about world-spanning processes of urban migration. In our response to the symposium, we expand on the street as both locus and epistemology, exploring the life worlds of migration not only in the space of the city, but through the lens of the street. Streets not only orient our study of urban migration in different cities across the UK, but streets also provide a way of finding out about how marginal places become increasingly differentiated through migration. We expand on street space and street method, drawing on our perspectives from streets in 4 cities, including Rookery Road in Birmingham, Stapleton Road in Bristol, Narborough Road in Leicester, and Cheetham Hill in Manchester. These 4 cities statistically represent, outside of London, significant aspects of urban diversity. And I think what's interesting about these 2 columns is their different temporalities. So the first column really emphasizes recent forms of migration, and the second column emphasizes long durées of sedimentations of migration over periods of time. Our entry point onto each street is by way of a qualitative survey, where we speak to every single independent proprietor along the street, and we give them both a spatial and a sociological reference point. During our first phase of fieldwork this year, we spoke directly with 314 out of approximately 600 proprietors. And our key points of engagement included, firstly, their work practices, such as their retail activities, their number of employees, their use of media, skill sets, because we thought it was really important, given that we always work in comparatively deprived locales, we wanted to kind of contravene some of the language of deprivation. So we look at things like previous forms of employment and education levels, their connections to the street, including duration on the street, forms of tenure, proximity to home, and crucially, their connections beyond the street, including their country of birth, their languages spoken, and their use of global and local markets. So what you're looking at there is an image of all the independent proprietors along Rookery Road and their respective countries of origin. In many instances, our surveys lasted a matter of minutes, and we generally had 5 minutes to interrupt an entrepreneurial rhythm. But occasionally, predetermined questions opened into more spontaneous conversations coupled with periods of observation. So this street-based research, which is both spontaneous, it's serendipitous and highly systematic, presented a view of each street as essentially diverse or as fundamentally variegated and increasingly variegated in demographic, spatial, and economic aspects. To start with, each street was composed of a number of countries of origin represented by the respective array of proprietors. So we are not exploring the phenomena, for example, of a Chinatown or a Little Italy. We're explicitly thinking about what kind of economies and sociabilities are possible when you get this kind of diversity in place. So there are 12 different countries of origin represented amongst the proprietors on Rookery Road in Birmingham, 22 in Narborough Road in Leicester, 12 in Cheetham Hill in Manchester, and 11 in Stapleton Road in Bristol. The convergence of these highly variegated countries of origin amongst the proprietors on single stretches of street begs the question most essentially of why these particular migrants land up in these particular places. And moreover, what kinds of economic practices emerge from these diverse intersections. To address these questions, we expand on how people and places diversify in an increasingly mobile but also unequal world. Drawing on our street analysis, we focus on what we call migrant diversities that emerge out of both structural conditions and individual resourcefulness. So this begins to play a little bit more on the street, not simply as a lens into agency, experience, feelings, objects, but into policies, systems of power, the structure of economy, etc. We reflect on how streets are combinations of highly regulated and informal systems of political and economic life. And in particular, we focus on two processes of variegation. The first is policy-driven diversification, and the second is economic diversification. Policy-driven diversification refers to the intended and unintended processes through which places diversify in relation to a density of legislations connected to migration. Our research revealed three essential trends across all four streets. The first is the great evidence of the liberal paradox. So countries in the Western world where advanced capitalism is very much in place actively solicit migrants to participate in the workplace, but at the same time try and construct national ideologies which are about far more singular understandings of who belongs. Secondly, we are increasingly in and of a world where there are an expanding number of cross-border migratory systems, and our very much debated position in Europe is one such of those expansions. But of course, we can never forget, and it's evident on all four of the maps that I've shown you, the histories of empire and the Commonwealth. And then thirdly, the spatial dispersal of crises. So we're going to explore with you in our presentation how policies such as the asylum dispersal scheme actually puts migrants in very particular locales in very particular cities, but this is also quite closely connected to the distribution of public resources such as housing. And secondly, we want to explore economic diversification, or how different forms of economic marginalization embed the migrant in place. Again, our survey data reveals three explicit trends. The first is the restrictive employment and opportunity structures. So there are very high correlations in the percentages in this country of who is self-employed relative to their ethnic minority status. And what was evident, and Robin will refer to this, is that although there were an awful lot of Eastern European customers on the streets, they were not occupying the retail space because they were able to find much broader work prospects than their brown and specifically Muslim counterparts. Secondly, the areas that we work in, by and large, have low value, low entry property markets. So this is a kind of outskirts urbanism in which the migrant is an active regenerator or renewer. And it allows for all sorts of experimentations, but it is also problematic in other ways. And then we want to also raise for you the kind of the en route mobility and the skilling and de-skilling processes that occur. So what we are going to be sharing with you today is how the body of the migrant is becoming increasingly variegated. They are required to speak a number of languages. They often have a number of occupations and educational skills. And we are observing not only the phenomena of the twice migrant, but the thrice plus migrant. I'm now going to hand over to Robin, and if you'll just give us 36 seconds to swap a bit of technology.
All good. Okay, hello everybody. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to explore some of the data that we have gathered from our fieldwork to really sort of unpack this idea of policy-driven diversification and economic-driven diversification. So here we have a quote here from Tariq. Tariq is a lifelong resident of Rookery Road, and he owns and runs a small independent business on the street. And what Tariq's articulating in this quote here is the increased diversification of Rookery Road through the arrival and settlement of new flows of migrants in recent years. And this is a narrative we collected and heard on all 4 of our roads. And our surveys also evidenced, as Susie said, a great number of different countries of births of proprietors. So the coming of superdiversity, conceptualized by Stephen Vertovec, certainly has some resonance on all 4 of our streets. But to unpack the increased diversity of the street, we want to ask, how does the individual of superdiversity, or increased diversity if you like, intersect with structure? What role does structure play in the diversification of place? So significantly what we're suggesting is that diversification of all 4 of our streets is symptomatic of broader political and policy issues. Thus, the migrant street is a lens into the material and embodied manifestation of policy and politics. So to unpack this a bit closer and start looking at it through our data, what I'm going to do here is explore the contemporary presence of migrant proprietors on Narborough Road in Leicester, and we're going to look at the duration of their businesses in Leicester. So the horizontal line there is the date of when their business opened on Narborough Road, and it dates from 1975 up until 2015. And at the bottom row there, you can see a list of countries of birth, and there's 22, I think, in total. 24% of the proprietors on Narborough Road had their businesses have been on the street for 20 years or more. 46% of proprietors had only been on the road for 5 years or less. So Narborough Road is very much a street with sort of churn and businesses that come and go. But there is also evidence of businesses that have been there for many years and succeeded on the streets. I could read out the list of proprietors there from different countries, but I'll leave it out because it does take quite a long time. Okay, so start understanding this great diversity. We're going to go back to the sort of early proprietors we've got here that emerged from around 1975. You can see the dots highlighted in red there, and there's dots to the left that are UK-born proprietors. Now what we're finding is very much these earlier proprietors on the street have come from East Africa. They're East African-born Asians, and they've ended up being on the street as a result of the East African refugee crisis between 1968 to 1976. Now, this is a diminishing population on Narborough Road. It only accounts for 11%. But when we listen to the anecdotal evidence of people on the street, they talk about how there was far more of a presence of these people previously. But it is changing due to their sort of success on the street, and they're moving to other areas. Now, restriction is an enduring feature of UK immigration policy, but history demonstrates that it rarely achieves what it sets out to do. And in 1972, Leicester City Council put this advert in a newspaper in Uganda in an attempt to discourage East African Asians from settling in Leicester. However, this did not work. It did the opposite and attracted a large number of East African Asians to Leicester. And there was 11,000, I think, in total that was recorded on the 2011 census. So what we're seeing very much here is of intentional and unintentional policies, legislations, political events, creating a layer of established diversity on Narborough Road. Just to go back to our graph here, and now we've highlighted the proprietors that have been on the street for 5 years or less. And this is when we could argue that we're moving into more of a super diversity, where we've got proprietors from lots of different countries. And again, we can look at this diversity and start seeing policy and legislation on the street. Firstly, we've got the Xylem and Immigration Act of 1999, which was an increase, or still is, an increase in global vulnerability, creating more movement that's visible on the street. 2004, we had the A8 accession of Eastern European countries to the EU. Britain, I think, was one of the only countries that didn't have a sort of regulation. They were just allowed to come in and work and have workers' rights, have freedom of the labour market. So Britain experienced huge numbers of Eastern Europeans coming in since 2004. Now, as Susie mentioned, it's quite interesting, as you can see, there's only two proprietors from Poland and one from Lithuania. And all 4 of our streets, on the census data, it stated there was a large number of Eastern Europeans in the area. But as the proprietors, they were not very present. They didn't have a good presence in running private businesses. or independent businesses. And when we looked at census data, what we found that the other European category had a far higher number of people employed in manufacturing, transport, and storage. And this, again, we can look into sort of structural limitations of people who are not white, that there is a need for them to open up self-employed businesses. Then in 2008, there was the global financial crisis, which was an increase of an increase in global instability, which again has increased mobility around the world and movement and the need for migration. And it's very interesting if you look at the most recent migration quarterly by the government in 2012. There's a very steep increase of EU 15 countries coming into Britain, and this was mainly Southern European people from Spain, people from Italy, Greece, etc., where their economic crisis become very profound, and they were moving into Britain as well. Now, I just want to return to the Xylem and Immigration Act, because this is an act and legislation which has great pertinence on all four of our streets. As Susie mentioned, part of the Xylem and Immigration Act was a dispersal policy. It was a policy to disperse asylum seekers and refugees away from the southeast of England, and there were a number of sanctuary cities selected in Britain. All four of our cities were selected as sanctuary cities. And on all four of our streets, there is a great presence of people that have come from countries that the principal flow of migration is asylum seekers and refugees. For example, here we've got highlighted the proprietors from countries Somalia, Kurdistan, Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka, and that was 14% of proprietors. Okay, just to sort of sum up some final points about the street and policy diversification. What looking at policy and diversification does is it very much gives us an historical lens into the street. The street is constructed and produced by intersecting policies in many different legislation frameworks at different temporal periods. The material street. Migration at street level is a lens into the material and embodied manifestations of intersecting policies and political events. And it's important to ask what sort of streets are being diversified by policy-driven diversification. And we are suggesting it's enunciated in streets within comparatively poor and marginal urban areas. And this is especially pronounced in the dispersal program of asylum seekers and refugees, which was where there was free housing, and quite often it was in the poorer parts of cities. Okay, now I'm just going to move on to the economic-driven diversification and look at some of our results in that section. So in all four of the streets, there is a variegation of retail spatialities, temporalities, opportunities, strategies, resources, successes and failures, mobilized by migrants. And here we have the smallest to largest units observed on Cheetham Hill Road in Manchester. So firstly, there are micro units of the pavement traders who set up rudimentary stalls and sell pay-as-you-go SIM cards that can make cheap calls to anywhere in the world. These normally take up 0.6 square meters. Normally one person working in them, generally self-employed, or they may receive commission from the shop that they are beside the larger shop. At the other end of the scale is the superstore. And the superstore on Cheetham Hill Road took over two large properties. One used to be a theatre, one used to be a bingo hall. It encompasses 1,000 square meters. It employs about 30 people from countries such as India, Pakistan, and Spain, what the manager told us in the shop. So the range on the street accommodates the precarious newcomer in frequently low-paid work, as well as a space for the migrant entrepreneur to grow substantial retail outlets. The variety of resources pieced together by migrant entrepreneurs in the context of the street reflects how businesses both falter and flourish. Again, to look at the we've looked at the spatial aspects of retail units. The duration of businesses and services reveals the variegation of economic opportunities that are encountered and mobilized by migrants. And here we have taken Rookery Road on Birmingham, and we've looked at the duration of the businesses, which stretches from 2015 nearly back to 1970. We've also categorized the businesses in different colors. And what we found was that 22% have been on the street for 20 years or more, and 32% of the businesses have been on the street for 5 years or less. So again, like Narborough Road, you're seeing these established businesses that are succeeding very well, but there's lots of new businesses where the new arrival of migrants are gaining an access onto the street, and they succeed and fail quite often. And also, I think it was interesting that technology and food outlets, predominantly fast food outlets, were what the newcomers, the newer businesses, were generally setting up. So in this image, we have visualized double or treble migrants who have migrated to 1 or 2 countries before arriving in Stapleton Road in Bristol. So we can see there's people who went from Jamaica to Spain to Bristol, to Somalia, Sweden, Bristol, etc. I'm sure you can see them there. So what we found with these multiple migrations and numerous changes of circumstances is it often resulted in distinctive shifts in occupation and processes of skilling and de-skilling. Migrants were having to be greatly resourceful to gain access to the economies of these different places that were settling. So for example, proprietor of a travel agency and a money remittance store on our survey had been an engineer in Uganda, had worked as a public servant in India, then worked at a petrol station when he had arrived in the UK, and finally set up shop on one of our streets. So we're very much seeing that because of these structural hurdles and structural limitations, that there needs to be a process of reskilling and de-skilling. Also, we recorded that the 2008 economic crisis had required people to change occupations and be very, very resourceful. This resourcefulness also translates into remarkable proficiencies that both demand of and permit the migrant to stretch their economic and cultural capital across local, regional, and global spheres. We were keen to document the skill sets of the migrants on the streets. So one of the things that we looked at was language proficiency, and we found that there was great language proficiency on all 4 of our streets. For example, for 3 languages, 60% Rookery Road, 63% Narborough Road, 68% Cheetham Hill Road, 40% Stapleton Road. Now, although Stapleton Road has a slightly smaller statistic there, 38% on Stapleton Road spoke 3 different language groups, such as Urdu, Somali, and English. So we're also seeing that there's a demand for migrants to have a very high skill set, again, to sort of engage and sort of negotiate these very deep structural limitations that they're living under, and the sort of marginalization that they're living under. Okay, so just some 3 quick final points with the street and economic diversification. It's a variegated street. The migrant street is a view into multiple retail practices and limitations, struggles and successes. It accommodates the precarious newcomer and frequently low-paid work, as well as a space for the migrant entrepreneur to grow substantial retail outlets. It's a mobile street. The mobility of migrants and subsequent dwelling in varied locales requires processes and practices of reskilling, de-skilling, and shifting occupations. Final point, the precarious street. The structural limitations of the streets can constrain the inhabitant, but also engender creativity and resourcefulness. Just pass you back on to Susie now.
So in conclusion, we return to the question of what the seemingly ordinary or even parochial street tells us about world-spanning processes of urban migration. On each of our 4 streets, we have seen an increase in the variegation of migrant proprietors over the period of half a century. There is simply no way in which this variegation can be explained through the current political rhetoric of either migrant illegality or the migrant who crosses the border only to rob us of our jobs and our welfare. The variegation we have evidenced is directly traceable to our unassailable connection to world politics, to advanced capitalism, and a density of paradoxical policies that at once attract and restrict the migrant. As the recent refugee crisis tragically highlights, features of political instability and pronounced economic inequality will increasingly be part of our reality, a reality inadequately and inhumanely served by inward-looking nationalist ideologies. We also learn from the street that the prevailing structures of a mobile and unequal world don't tell us enough about what it means to live as an urban migrant. Despite gross levels of discrimination, significant levels of resourcefulness persist, making for a diverse and imaginative urbanism in places that are marginalized and undervalued. We contend that while the street method is always essentially grounded, it is substantially pushed and advanced when the liveliness of structure and practice are simultaneously pursued. As the news article reports, the advance of a highly unjust Immigration Act passed by UK parliamentary decree in 2014 is growing its discriminatory tentacles. While contemporary mobility increases and variegates, so too does an ever more elaborate architecture of control. The news article indicates how controls are pushing into every aspect of daily life, from renting a flat to visiting a GP to opening a shop. There is absolutely no doubt who will be most at the brunt of these conservative endeavors. The street urges us to look more closely at migration as the lived practices of regulation and resourcefulness. It reminds us, importantly as researchers, that we must refute the ideology of an unjust and prejudiced Immigration Act at all costs. Thank you very much.